welcome to the Play Podcast with me, Douglas Schatz. Hello, and welcome to episode 12 of the Play Podcast, where we explore the greatest new and classic plays. I'm Douglas Schatz, founder and host of the Play Podcast. Our episode today will follow a different format to the usual in-depth exploration of our selected play. Our schedule of interviews with our special guests has been interrupted this week by various summer holiday commitments. So I'm going to take the opportunity to share some of the footnotes that we've compiled from the research and conversations that we've had so far on the podcast. As you will know, a footnote is one of those extra bits of related information that you find at the bottom of the page in a printed book, usually denoted in the flow of the text by a number or asterisk. A footnote can, of course, be a very brief reference or fact, although those familiar with the American writer David Foster Wallace will know that they can also run to many pages in themselves and can offer a diverting tributary away from the mainstream of the narrative. So, I hope our episode today will prove. The footnotes that we've assembled are in some sense the clippings on our editing floor, although in fact mostly they never even reached the original recording. They consist of observations that we've had following our sessions, as well as fragments of research that we had assembled in preparation for our conversation with our special guests that just didn't find their natural way into the conversation we recorded. What follows today is a smorgasbord of such titbits. If they are to your taste, you can find more on the footnotes pages of our website, which of course you're welcome to dip into following each episode. The very first episode of our podcast was devoted to Ibsen's classic proto-feminist play, A Doll's House, written in 1879. My inspiration for choosing A Doll's House was fueled by my attending a day-long symposium at the Young Vic Theatre entitled Reimagining Nora, which, as the title suggests, examined why the story of young wife and mother who chooses to walk out of her family home has remained so popular and relevant over the past 140 years. The symposium was organized and chaired by playwright and professor of contemporary theater Dan Rebelato, who naturally became our first guest on the podcast. One of the many distinguished speakers at the symposium was Tori Rem, Norwegian professor of English literature and an editor on the latest Penguin Classic edition of Ibsen's plays. Just one of the fascinating things that I learned from Tori's speech that day was that Ibsen's plays were always published in book form before the play was performed. He had a huge popular following and enjoyed enormous book sales, particularly in Norway, where drama was more popular than the novel as a literary genre in the late 19th century. Tori described crowds of people waiting on the dockside for the ship from Denmark to arrive and unload the first copies of one of Ibsen's newly published plays, which is a wonderful image of literary enthusiasm. 8,000 copies of A Doll's House were sold in the first month of December 1879, for example. A healthy number, even by today's standards. The first productions of A Doll's House were not without controversy. The play premiered in Copenhagen in December 1879, closely followed by productions in Stockholm, Oslo, and Bergen. It then opened in Germany, where famously the actress playing Nora refused to perform the play as written, declaring, "I would never leave my children." Since the playwright's wishes were not protected by copyright, Ibsen decided to avoid the danger of the play being rewritten by a lesser dramatist, and he committed what he called a barbaric outrage on his own play, giving it an alternative ending in which Nora does not leave her husband and children. This version played in a number of German cities during 1880, but ironically was not a success, and the producer restored the original ending. The first performance of the play in London was an adaptation called Breaking a Butterfly by Henry Arthur Jones and Henry Herman in March 1884, neither of which, of course, I've ever heard of, which by all accounts was a travesty of Ibsen's work. In this version, Nora is saved from her rebellion, and from immortality, I might say, by convincing a faithful clerk to steal her promissory note from Krogstad's desk, thereby removing the blackmail threat. The curtain fell upon a happy home. One of the reasons that Ibsen's controversial plays were freely staged in Norway, unlike elsewhere, was that there was no state censorship. Whereas in Britain, the Lord Chamberlain's office still had the power to ban a play or request changes before allowing it to be openly produced. A Doll's House seems to have slipped through the Lord Chamberlain's net, Nora's actions in leaving her family home apparently being deemed too absurd altogether to be obviously offensive. Whereas Ibsen's next play, Ghosts, was not so fortunate. The subjects of venereal disease and incest, of course, were thought not fit for public display. Ghosts, which was written 2 years after A Doll's House, in 1881, did not have a UK production until 10 years later, and even that was a single private showing by the subscription-only Independent Theatre Society, whose members happened to include playwright George Bernard Shaw and authors Thomas Hardy and Henry James. The first proper production of the play in Britain, in its original form, as Ibsen wrote it, opened on 7th June 1889 at the Novelty Theatre. The critics savaged the play, but again, the audiences loved it, and the run was extended. Before this public production, there had been 2 private productions in its proper form in London. One featured none other than George Bernard Shaw in the role of Krogstad. Shaw became an outspoken champion of Ibsen, most notably in his essay Quintessence of Ibsenism, published in 1891. He especially admired Ibsen's independent-minded characters, who resist the hypocrisies of social convention, characters he often portrayed in his own plays. He apparently once stated that he thought Ibsen was superior to Shakespeare because of the social impact of his plays. According to Shaw, A Doll's House will be flat as ditch water, when A Midsummer Night's Dream will still be fresh as paint, but it will have done more work in the world. He might have been right, considering the continuing relevance of A Doll's House in our own times. One of the most compelling testimonies of its enduring impact was given by Hattie Morahan, who played Nora in the Young Vics production of the play a few years ago. She spoke at the Reimagining Nora Symposium, and she said that she and her fellow cast members knew people personally who decided to leave their partners after seeing their production of the play. That, lest we forget, is the power of theater. During our second episode, on Anton Chekhov's play Uncle Vanya, my guest, publisher Nick Hearn, and I talked about how it can seem unlikely that Chekhov's late plays are described as comedies when the characters are all so unhappy. In fact, by way of a classic footnote to this point, I noticed that the published versions of Chekhov's plays include slightly different subtitles that perhaps signal their intentions. The Seagull and the Cherry Orchard are explicitly called a comedy in 4 acts. Uncle Vanya is described as scenes from country life in 4 acts, which suggests a potential variety of stories and fates. Three Sisters, on the other hand, is signposted as a drama in 4 acts, presaging a more conventionally serious play, I'd say. Chekhov, in fact, said of Three Sisters that it turned out to be dreary, long, and awkward. I say awkward because it has 4 heroines and a spirit more gloomy than gloom itself. I confess that I've often thought that it felt that way. We also talked in the podcast about the partnership between Chekhov and the famous producer and director Konstantin Stanislavski, which was hugely significant for both men and for the development of drama. Stanislavski had a special understanding of Chekhov's artistic intentions and method, and his interpretations of Chekhov's work transformed his reputation. He went on to apply this understanding to create a new form of dramatic technique that focused on the inner truth of characters' stories. There is a passage from Stanislavski's book, My Life in Art, that is quoted in the introduction to the Penguin Classic collection of Chekhov's plays that I thought worth repeating for its perceptive summary of that elusive yet universal quality of Chekhov's vision. In his dramatic works, Chekhov has achieved an equal mastery over the internal as well as the external truth. The truth moves us by its unexpectedness, by its mysterious links with our forgotten past, by its inexplicable foreknowledge of the future, by that peculiar logic of living experience which baffles common sense, which seems to mock or even play malicious tricks on human beings, at times perplexing them utterly and at times making them laugh. During my research before Nick and I talked about Uncle Vanya, I was struck by how wide-ranging Chekhov's influence has been on the writers and makers of theater of the past 125 years. Here are a few direct attributions that I came across. George Bernard Shaw's play of 1919, Heartbreak House, was clearly modeled on Chekhov, as he explicitly acknowledges in its subtitle, a fantasia in the Russian manner on English themes. Its ensemble cast of English gentry locked together in a country house under the existential threat of the First World War clearly echoes Chekhov's settings, although Shaw is more overt in his use of his characters as mouthpieces for social messages. As we've said, Stanislavski and indirectly Chekhov had a major impact on the course of 20th century drama through their influence, for example, on Lee Strasberg, founder of the Group Theater Company and the Actors Studio in New York, where he developed in his training what became known as method acting. Strasberg was in the audience when the Moscow Art Theater brought its productions of The Cherry Orchard and Three Sisters to New York in 1923. Strasberg taught performers to access their personal feelings and memories to convey the inner truths of the characters. Although it is not essential to apply the method to effectively dramatize Chekhov, Strasberg's response to his work in his subsequent approach highlights the psychological realism of Chekhov's drama. In the 1940s in America, the plays of Tennessee Williams and Arthur Miller reflected the influence of Chekhov in their focus on precise family dynamics and personal frailties heightened by a mythical vision. When Williams was asked to name some of his favorite writers, he's reputed to have said, Chekhov, Chekhov, Chekhov. I also have noticed that several of our guests on the podcast to date have referred with admiration to the influence or even the supremacy of Chekhov. As we discussed in episode 10, for example, Mike Bartlett acknowledged that his recent play Albion is modeled on Chekhov in a number of ways. And in our most recent episode, playwright David Eldridge said, and I quote, "One of the best things about Chekhov, and why he is maybe the greatest writer for me, maybe even greater than Shakespeare, is that Chekhov is able to sound the note of humor and desperation simultaneously." Which brings us back to where we started. Chekhov's unlikely but truthful comedies about unhappy people. There were two facts which I discovered in my readings in preparation for my conversation with Matt Fitzpatrick in our third episode about Samuel Beckett's Endgame, which I think in their small but enjoyable way constitute perfect footnotes. The first is that when Endgame was in rehearsal at the Royal Court in London in April 1957, rehearsals were also taking place in the same theatre of John Osborne's The Entertainer with Laurence Olivier. It is tantalizing to imagine these two landmark productions happening at the same time in the same building, and to picture Olivier and Beckett conversing over drinks and dinner together, as we know they did when they overlapped at that moment of theatrical history. The English language version of Endgame, which Beckett had translated, was promised to the Royal Court for that summer in 1957. But as we noted in our podcast, the Lord Chamberlain objected to God being called a bastard, although paradoxically he did not seem to mind that Ham also said in the play that he doesn't exist. Beckett was naturally unimpressed by the censor's illogical intervention, and hereafter he apparently referred to the British censor as Lord Chamberpot. During our conversation about Endgame, Matt referred to the game being acted out in the play as one analogous, perhaps, to chess. Beckett was, in fact, a lifelong chess player, building a library of books on the game in which he annotated his personal learnings. In chess, the end game refers to the closing moves from which the end is inevitable, but the moves still need to be played out. Ham says at one point, "Me to play," indicating his turn in the alternate nature of whatever game he thinks they are playing. Ham may stand for the figure of the king, who is hierarchically powerful, but also the most limited in his movement, as Ham is, trapped in his chair. As Ham's servant, Clove is but a pawn, although pawns also have the potential to turn themselves into a queen and gain much more freedom. And there is certainly some suggestion that Clove could decide to break away at some point, albeit this is usually a very distant hope. The specifics of the analogy to chess may be less important than the philosophical resonances. We are all confined to the board and the rules of the game, as well as dependent on other players' actions. Most of us are poor players, with little understanding of the almost infinite possible ways that the game will unfold and end. Beckett's plays have been labeled as part of the so-called theater of the absurd, works which deal with themes similar to those of the roughly contemporary existentialist thinkers. The term theater of the absurd was coined by Martin Esslin in a book of the same name, in which Beckett is included. Esslin argued these plays were the fulfillment of Albert Camus' concept of the absurd, as defined in his 1942 essay, The Myth of Sisyphus, which highlights man's repetitive and vain responses to a world without meaning. Esslin did argue that the result was not simply despair. It is a challenge to accept the human condition as it is, in all its mystery and absurdity, and to bear it with dignity, nobly, responsibly, precisely because there are no easy solutions to the mysteries of existence, because ultimately man is alone in a meaningless world. The shedding of easy solutions, of comforting illusions, may be painful, but it leaves behind it a sense of freedom and relief. And that is why, in the last resort, the theater of the absurd does not promote tears of despair, but the laughter of liberation. Somehow, Beckett's bleak vision is also funny, perhaps not so unlike Chekhov's unhappy comedies. Beckett may have had the last laugh in his own endgame. He died in December 1989 at the age of 83. He is buried in Montparnasse Cemetery in Paris with a simple granite gravestone that followed his directive that it should be any color so long as it's gray. Our next episode was Neil Docking's funny and deeply moving play, The Revlon Girl, which tells the story of 4 women coming together in a room in the Aberfan Hotel in South Wales to receive beauty tips from a visiting Revlon cosmetics rep. What these women have in common is that they have all lost children who were killed when the coal tips above the village of Aberfan had collapsed and buried their school 8 months previously in October 1966. The political aftermath of the Aberfan disaster carried on for more than 40 years. There was much anger in the period following the disaster because many felt that there had been warnings about the possible threat of the tips and that the tragedy could have been avoided. At the coroner's inquest 3 days after the disaster, one man, when the names of his wife and 2 sons were called out in a list of accidental deaths, he shouted, "No, sir, buried alive by the National Coal Board." In fact, the report of the official inquiry that followed stated outright that blame for the disaster rests upon the National Coal Board, and that it was their strong and unanimous view that the Aberfan disaster could and should have been prevented. Neither the NCB nor any of its employees were ever prosecuted, and the organization was not fined. Initially, the National Coal Board offered bereaved families £50 in compensation. But this was raised to £500 for each bereaved family. The organization called the amount a good offer. The Aberfan Disaster Memorial Fund was set up on the day of the disaster. It received nearly 88,000 contributions, totaling £1.75 million. In 1967, however, the Charity Commission advised that any money paid from this fund to the parents of bereaved families would be against the terms of the trust deed, and suggested that no more than £500 should be paid. Members of the trust told the commission that £5,000 was to be paid to each family. The commission agreed, but stated that each case should be examined before payment to ascertain whether the parents had been close to their children and were thus likely to be suffering mentally. The mind boggles that the commission could imagine that any parent would not be suffering mentally at the deaths of their children, or how they imagined judgments about the closeness of families would be made. Many were concerned that the remaining tips above the village remained unsafe. The residents petitioned the Secretary of State for Wales for the tips to be removed. At one point, they entered the Welsh office and left a small pile of coal slurry on his table. The tips were removed only after a lengthy fight against resistance from the National Coal Board and the government on the grounds of cost. The final clearing was funded by the government and the National Coal Board, but not without an additional forced contribution of £150,000 being taken from the Memorial Fund. It was not until 1997 that the British government paid back the £150,000 to the fund, and in 2007, 41 years later, the Welsh Assembly donated £1.5 million to the fund and £500,000 to the Aberfan Education Charity as recompense for the money wrongly taken. Watchers of the TV series The Crown, who have seen the Aberfan episode in Season 3, will know the story of the Queen's visit to Aberfan in the wake of the disaster, or rather, her non-visit. The Queen did not visit the village in the days immediately following the disaster, sparking criticism in the press and questions about why she wouldn't go. Finally, after sending her husband, Prince Philip, in her place, she came to Aberfan 8 days after the disaster to survey the damage and speak with survivors. Nearly 4 decades later, in 2002, the Queen said that not visiting Aberfan immediately after the disaster was her biggest regret. In the play, one of the mothers, Rona, challenges the value of their decorating their faces with the makeup products the Revlon Girl has brought for them, saying, "No matter how much paint we put on, we're all the same underneath." In other words, the surface makeup won't cover up their devastation. However, the Revlon Girl tells the women a story about the depression that her mother fell into after the death of her brother as a child. Her mother succumbed to an all-consuming listlessness in which she stopped caring about anything, including her own appearance. She didn't bother to put her face on, as she once did every day. One of the first steps or signs of her recovering was her beginning again to look after her own appearance, an act that signaled her regaining some self-respect and of finding the courage to face the world again. As the Revlon Girl says to Rona, it's not just lipstick. Neil and I talked about this scene in the podcast, and following the publication of our episode, a listener was kind enough to send me a note that resonated with this theme of the play. The note contained a quotation from a book called 5 Days That Shocked the World by Nicholas Best. It is a diary extract from British Lieutenant Colonel Mervyn W. Gonin, commander of the 11th Light Field Ambulance, who was among the first British soldiers to liberate Bergen-Belsen concentration camp in 1945. It is an upsetting quotation. It was shortly after the British Red Cross arrived, though it may have no connection, that a very large quantity of lipstick arrived. This was not at all what we men wanted. We were screaming for hundreds and thousands of other things, and I don't know who asked for lipstick. I wish so much that I could discover who did it. It was the action of genius, sheer unadulterated brilliance. I believe nothing did more for these internees than the lipstick. Women lay in bed with no sheets and no nightie, but with scarlet red lips. You saw them wandering around with nothing but a blanket over their shoulders, but with scarlet red lips. At last, someone had done something to make them individuals again. They were someone, no longer merely the number tattooed on their arm. At last, they could take an interest in their appearance. That lipstick started to give them back their humanity. These are grim images, as are the pictures of the Aberfan disaster. But I assure you that The Revlon Girl is a play full of humor, resilience, and hope. When I was reading up about how Shakespeare came to write The Tempest before I talked with Tim McMullen in episode 5, I was taken with the idea that Shakespeare would have been very familiar with the news about the voyages being undertaken to the New World in North America during the early years of the 17th century. Accounts of the contact with native peoples in the New World would certainly have informed Shakespeare's creation of the character of Caliban, along with the theme of the differences between so-called civilized and native people and cultures. Even the story of the shipwreck itself may have been based on the fate of one of the colonialist ships bound for North America. In 1609, 2 years before Shakespeare wrote The Tempest, a fleet of ships was dispatched to North America to establish the British colony at Jamestown in Virginia. Famously, one of the ships, the Sea Venture, foundered in a storm, was separated from the others, but somehow beached safely on the island of Bermuda. The tale of their miraculous landing on a paradise island was popularized in various pamphlets published in 1609 and 10, from which Shakespeare may have picked up the germ of the play. Here's another seafaring footnote. When Ariel tells Prospero how he went about manufacturing the storm that brings the ship to the island at the beginning of the play, he described how he flamed amazement. "Sometime I'd divide and burn in many places. On the topmast, the yards and bowsprit, would I flame distinctly, then meet and join." The flares, appearing at the tips of the ship's masts, might remind the sailors of the maritime weather phenomenon known as St. Elmo's fire, where balls of light created naturally during an electrical storm would appear at the exposed points of the spars. St. Elmo is an Italian name for St. Erasmus, the patron saint of sailors, whose martyrdom included being painted in pitch and set alight, after which his intestines were extracted and wound around a windlass. Sailors prayed to him for deliverance from the storm, seeing the electrical discharges as evidence of his presence. So may they have prayed at the sight of Ariel's lights in the tempest. During my conversation with Mark Taylor Batty about Harold Pinter's play Betrayal in episode 6, we talked about the 7-year-long affair that Harold Pinter had had with Joan Bakewell, on which his play is based. As Mark pointed out, Bakewell was not happy at the way their relationship was portrayed in the play. In fact, back in 1978, the year Betrayal premiered, she wrote her own play in response, giving a different slant on the same affair. Her play, called Keeping in Touch, was not actually produced until it appeared as a radio play on the BBC in 2017. In Bakewell's fictionalized version of their affair, she emphasizes the restrictions that the woman feels within her marriage. 3 years at university, and here I am stuck at home with small children, she pointedly tells her husband, adding, "Is this it?" She is tempted to embark on an affair herself with a famous architect who is pursuing her, but only does so when she discovers that her husband has been unfaithful. In a pointed twist on the central scene in Pinter's play, set in Venice, where Robert discovers that Emma has been having an affair with his best friend Jerry, in Bakewell's version, it is the wife that discovers her husband's infidelity, also while they are in Venice. Perhaps the differences in these portrayals only affirms one of the themes of betrayal, that we cannot know what really goes on within a marriage, and that we each create our own version of truth. Speaking of Venice, I greatly appreciated Pinter's specific references to the island of Torcello in his play. Robert has nostalgic memories of reading Yeats on Torcello in his idealistic youth. And of course, Robert and Emma are planning to return to Torcello for a reprise of the first romantic time they visited only 6 months after they were married 10 years earlier. The island of Torcello sits in the Venetian lagoon, some 40 minutes by boat from Venice proper. It is well off the beaten tourist track, so if you make the effort to go out there, as I have, you will find a beautifully peaceful place. There are few inhabitants or dwellings. Most prominent is the 11th century church, with its striking bell tower and magnificent Byzantine mosaics. The island also has literary associations. Ernest Hemingway spent a month here in 1948, staying at the small hotel on the island, writing his novel Across the River and Into the Trees. So Pinter's choice of Torcello is not accidental. It is the perfect place to reference the romantic and literary past for Emma and Robert. A past, of course, that will now be soured for both of them. Mark and I also talked in our podcast about the kind of society that prevailed in 1978 when Betrayal was written. The 1970s was a period of significant social change, and some of these trends are reflected in the lives of the characters. In the early 1970s, the so-called women's liberation movement was gaining momentum, with widespread media attention and national conferences being organized. One of the tenets of Women's Lib was the call to allow women to look beyond the limited role of mother and housewife. Germaine Greer's The Female Eunuch, proposing that the traditional suburban family represses women, rendering them eunuchs, was a bestseller at the time. The character of Emma, based as we know on Joan Bakewell, is in the forefront of this social change, with her busy job running an art gallery while maintaining the life of the family. The 1960s and 70s also heralded an era of increased sexual promiscuity. There were several developments that helped fuel this sexual freedom. The contraceptive pill became available to married women in 1961 and to all women via the NHS in 1967. In 1967, the Abortion Act was passed, legalizing abortion, and homosexuality was decriminalized. In the early 1970s, the UK divorce law was also changed to establish a spouse's equal right to the property of marriage. This would establish conditions that would enable women to exit a marriage. The divorce rate in the UK subsequently doubled between 1971 and 1980. The 1970s also saw an increase in reported incidents of domestic violence, perhaps reflecting the beginning of a change in attitude to the acceptability of the behavior that Robert refers to so casually in the play. Women's refuges were set up in several cities, and victim support was founded in 1974, with 30 schemes in operation around the country by 1978. While the characters in the play still portray some of the now outdated features of gender relationships at that time, we also recognize in their lives the emerging shape of our own world that started at that time. It's interesting to reflect on how much a play is of its time and how much remains true and relevant over time. The social attitudes and expectations between the couples in Betrayal, or in Duncan Macmillan's play Lungs, which was the subject of our next episode, may differ in some outward ways, but the inner hopes and fears incited by love are not unlike those experienced by the characters of Chekhov, Ibsen, or Shakespeare. Certainly, Claire Foy and Matt Smith, as the leads in Lungs, allowed us not only to see the practical challenges they were navigating as a couple of their times, but also the ongoing internal emotional negotiations with themselves and with each other. Of course, the play was not just about their personal relationship. Much of their dialogue concerned the state of the planet and its future. The final section of the play fast forwards to paint a picture of apocalyptic events unfolding in the global climate. Forests have disappeared, flights are being grounded, and everything is covered in ash. These references reminded me that Macmillan wrote the play back in 2010-11, when you may recall the world was shocked by the explosion of a little-known Icelandic volcano, and normal life was suspended on an unprecedented scale. The warning that volcano sent us may have seemed an anomaly 10 years ago when Duncan wrote his play, but it feels all too commonplace now. Although the social conventions have certainly changed since the 1950s, when Terence Rattigan wrote his masterpiece, The Deep Blue Sea, his portrait of the doomed liaison between Hester Collier and Freddie Page displays all of the desperations of any unhappy love affair. In fact, so charged are the emotions that Hester feels that Peggy Ashcroft, who played her in the first production of The Deep Blue Sea, said of the sensation she felt portraying the character, "I feel as if I'm walking about with no clothes on." Her comment vividly conveys the sense we have throughout the play that Hester's inner life is completely exposed to us. Her passion, her fear, her humiliation and shame are so raw and visible. She cannot disguise her desperation or despair, which is what makes the play so vivid and painful to watch. Rattigan's play is flawlessly structured, and the dialogue so precisely tuned that it feels somehow effortlessly true. I was therefore somewhat surprised to learn during my researches that the British Library holds no fewer than 7 drafts of The Deep Blue Sea, which reveal how Rattigan refined the script in successive versions over the 2 years he spent writing the play. Of course, it is naive of me to expect that such a finely honed piece could be made without such careful revision. In general, the changes he made were to make things less explicit, and in so doing, he enhanced the complexity and power of the play. For example, in an early draft, Hester herself literally labels her feelings for Freddie as an infatuation or sex obsession. In fact, her feelings are much more complicated than that, which her husband, Sir William, clearly doesn't understand, but which we sense without her seeking to explain them. Another example of where less is more can be found in the evolution of the character Mr. Miller, the Austrian doctor who has been struck off at some point in his past for a reason that we do not ever learn. In an early draft, Ratigan reveals the nature of the crime that resulted in a prison sentence and his disgrace. He assaulted a female patient and tried to sell her morphine. Giving us such details would have discredited Miller's moral integrity, and that integrity underpins his support and advice for Hester. As I've mentioned, the nature of Hester's feelings for Freddie are the subject of a debate between her and Sir William on the difference between love and lust. As they are constrained by the conventional civilities of the time, they cannot bring themselves to address the terms directly. So they trade quotations from Shakespeare, as one does, the construing of which is the perfect purpose of a footnote. So, here's the footnote to their Shakespearean sparring. Hester begins by suggesting that Sir William only understands the decorous kind of love, the thing you read about in your beloved Jane Austen or Anthony Trollope. It droppeth as the gentle dew from heaven. In fact, she's got the quotation slightly wrong. Portia in The Merchant of Venice is actually describing the quality of mercy rather than love, which drops as a gentle dew from heaven, and which ironically, of course, both Hester and Freddie are in need of. So then she tries again. Love comforteth like sunshine after rain, suggesting again the gentler form of passion Sir William understands. Sir William counters with the next line of Shakespeare's verse, and lust's effect is tempest after sun, making his point about the destructive power of lust, which of course he believes is all that Hester and Freddie feel for each other. These lines are from Shakespeare's poem Venus and Adonis, and although Sir William does not carry on to quote them, the lines that follow in the poem further make Sir William's case that their love is not the real thing, for their lustful infatuation will inevitably pall. The lines go, love's gentle spring doth always fresh remain. Lust's winter comes ere summer hath begun. Love surfeits not. Lust like glutton dies. Love is all truth. Lust full of forged lies. Here endeth the Shakespearean footnote. There is a specific reference deserving of a footnote in Nigel Slater's Toast, the play written by Henry Fallu Bennett, based on Nigel Slater's award-winning memoir of his childhood and its food in the 1960s in Wolverhampton. Nigel's dad has been persuaded by an image of a healthy young boy used in the newspaper advertisements by the Egg Marketing Board at that time, that if Nigel were to consume more eggs, he would take a proper interest in masculine pursuits such as sports, rather than cooking. The image in the advertisements of Sam tucking into his breakfast eggs, along with the benefits of protein, iron, and vitamins, is enough to convince Dad that if you see a healthy sporty boy who can't eat enough eggs, and a spotty Nancy boy who won't eat any, it doesn't take a genius to work out that eggs are the answer. Here's the footnote. The newspaper ads that Nigel was force-fed were part of a long-running campaign by the Egg Marketing Board that ran from 1957 to 1971 and included a famous series of TV ads featuring the comedian Tony Hancock that first appeared in 1965. Writer Fay Weldon is famously credited with creating the slogan, "Go to work on an egg and be your best all day." Nigel's dad's hope that the consumption of eggs would enhance his son's sporting abilities was perhaps boosted by one of the ads that featured the footballer George Best, who answers a letter from Sam, the poster boy, with the exhortation, "I think you are quite right about having a proper egg breakfast every day to do your best. No pun intended. And I always have one myself." There's also a personal footnote to this footnote, which may be of interest to no one but myself. But when I was a young boy, breakfast was prepared for us by a nanny who on alternate days served us scrambled eggs and insisted that we finish them before we could leave the table. I loathed scrambled eggs, and to this day still cannot eat them. Our nanny was British. Perhaps she knew these advertisements. I was talking earlier about the individual couple in lungs who are worried about the future health of the planet. Their personal concerns make the subject of the climate crisis one of the larger themes of that play. This examination of their individual lives evinces the idea that politics is personal, a truth clearly manifest in Mike Bartlett's State of the Nation play, Albion, which I had the privilege to talk about with its stars Victoria Hamilton and Nick Rowe in episode 10. One of the things that is so stimulating about Albion is the way that the spectrum of values that individual characters hold as they go about their daily lives reflects the profile of the country's political landscape writ large. One can see the debate about so many of the big issues of the day being played out in the small exchanges between the characters. We also talked in our podcast about the different audience responses to the play between when it was first performed in 2017 during the height of the Brexit debate and in 2020 when the fervor of the debate had waned. Mike Bartlett referred to what the audience brings when they come to watch a show as the beholder's share of the communal artistic experience. At the time of the first production, our share would have been hugely informed by our preoccupation with Brexit, such that the line from Audrey describing her garden as our little piece of the world, and we're allowed to do with it exactly as we like, resonated with pointed political meaning. However, Mike has also said that he did not want the play to be about a single political issue. And coming back to the play now, it feels richer, with many other themes and characters' personal concerns coming to the fore. In fact, the play demonstrates how politics is at heart personal, that our views of the world come from our personal emotional lives. The catalyst of the play is Audrey's dream to restore the Garden of Albion to its historic glory. Mike Bartlett has acknowledged that the original garden that is described in the play as consisting of 31 separate rooms is based on the arts and craft garden at Hidcote in the Cotswolds. Hidcote was created by Lawrence Johnson, an American from a wealthy family who settled with his mother on the Hidcote Manor estate, where he began laying out his famous garden in 1910. The garden is distinctive for its conception of outdoor rooms, each with a thematic identity, such as the white or fuchsia gardens, all separated by hedges, hornbeam, and stone walls. Johnson was also renowned for his traveling the world to bring back rare plant specimens to his garden. Like Weatherbury, the fictional creator of the garden in Albion, Johnston had also been a soldier who fought with the British in the Boer War. Audrey refers in the play to recreating in her garden the original Red Garden, which Weatherbury conceived as a tribute to the dead in the First World War. It's about blood, she says, including, poignantly, that of her own soldier son James, who was killed by a car bomb in a more recent war. As we noted in our conversation, the garden is also clearly a general metaphor for Britain, and as such, Audrey's description of its many different rooms that can never be appreciated in one view and had to be experienced as a journey suggests perhaps the complex history and composition of our society in Britain today. Albion is a play whose setting, subject, and scope also echo the form of the plays of the great Russian playwright Anton Chekhov. Chekhov again. As we described in the podcast, the play is set in what amounts to a country estate with an ensemble cast of family characters, as well as a range of servants and local neighbors. As in Chekhov, not a lot happens within the actual action of the play. It consists of merely a series of conversations in the garden. But also, as with Chekhov, a lot happens to the characters offstage before and during the play. Audrey's son James, who we just mentioned, has been killed in military service. His partner Anna has saved his sperm so that she has been able to conceive a child after his death. In the play, we only see the first meeting of Audrey's daughter Sarah with Audrey's lifelong friend Catherine and the spark of their attraction to each other. We learn in the following act that they have had a passionate affair, much against Audrey's wishes, but the relationship has already failed, breaking Zara's heart. The doomed affair is mapped out exactly in the same way that Nina falls for and is rejected by Trigorin in Chekhov's play The Seagull. Mike Bartlett specifically also cited Chekhov's ability to represent various points of view without favoring one, as he does so effectively himself in Albion. He shows us multiple facets of his characters, their faults as well as their redeeming qualities. We come away from a Chekhov play and from Albion not with a simple view of the world, but touched by the imperfect humanity of the characters and the world. The central question for the characters in Chekhov's plays is almost universally how to identify your personal dreams, find the energy and faith to pursue them, and deal with the disappointments that inevitably ensue. So it is in Albion. The answers to such questions are also connected to the different view of life one has when we are young as opposed to when we are older. Catherine, for example, who is in her 50s and has experienced both success and disappointment, sees the light of hope and potential in young Zara's bright eyes, untainted, as she says, by the mortality, loss, or cruelty associated with being alive. You're young enough not to have fully seen the horror of the world. While Catherine suggests that Zara's youthful hope may be naive, she also acknowledges that the wisdom she has gained with age is inevitably accompanied by sadness. In fact, by the end of the play, there is a sense that Zara has gained a level of maturity through her unhappy affair with Catherine, in once again, much the same way that Nina does in The Seagull. She has earned a knowledge through suffering and love that seems necessary to live life more truthfully, and which will equip Zara to be a better writer, as it also enabled Nina to become a more substantial actress in The Seagull. I've always been intrigued by epigraphs that are printed in the published text of a play. Audiences who see a live performance of a play are not generally privileged, of course, to know what an epigraph says, although, of course, the director and actors will absorb it into their preparation for the play you see. Only when you read the play text do you enjoy the additional clue to a playwright's intent that an epigraph perhaps provides. There are two epigraphs that precede the text of David Eldridge's wonderful play, Beginning, which was the subject of our last episode. The first is a quotation from Joseph Conrad's novel, Under Western Eyes. Who knows what true loneliness is? Not the conventional word, but the naked terror. To the lonely themselves, it wears a mask. The most miserable outcast hugs some memory or some illusion. This is a pretty dark thought for what on the surface at least initially appears to be some sort of rom-com play about dating. In fact, as we discover as the couple, Laura and Danny, begin to open up to each other, they both suffer from desperate loneliness. Danny reveals in passing that he has considered suicide, and when Laura confesses the extent of her loneliness by describing her life as a shell of activity that she daren't look inside, her words echo Conrad's image of the deep inner darkness that we must hide from ourselves. The second epigraph of the play is a cryptic piece of dialogue from a play by German playwright Franz Kreutz called Through the Leaves, published in 1976. During our conversation in the podcast, David cited the work of Kreutz as one of his inspirations to create his naturalistic play. This is the extract in the epigraph, a snippet of conversation between Martha and Otto. Martha, if you wasn't here with me tonight, I'd go to the pictures. What's on? Ben-Hur. It's an oldie. Must be 10 years since I saw it, but it's a film you never forget. You ever seen it? No. Without any additional context from the original play, what does this brief exchange between Martha and Otto suggest? Perhaps that Martha is another lonely soul. She would be going to the movies on her own, if not with Otto. And although she may be seeking some companionship from Otto, there appears to be a gap between their personal interests and passions, and therefore who they are and what the potential of their relationship may be. Much like Laura and Danny in the scene in Beginning, when they try to dance together, but come up against the fact that they have different tastes in music. Even if I may be reading too much into the interpretation of these epigraphs, I enjoy the way that they set off thematic ripples as you push out into the play. Also in the footnotes to the published play, David is very specific about the location of Laura's flat, where the whole conversation between her and Danny takes place. It is in Crouch End, London, and Danny talks with admiration of her having succeeded in buying a flat in such a nice area. The Pesto Triangle, he calls it, along with nearby Highgate and Muswell Hill. Why is the play so specific about the locations the characters inhabit? There's certainly some tension suggested between Danny and Laura that comes from his perception of a class divide. It would be difficult for Danny to escape this feeling based on their respective positions on the so-called property ladder. Laura has successfully traded her way up to her flat in this desirable area, while he has sunk down the ladder following his divorce, living back in his childhood bedroom in Essex with his mother and grandmother. The kind of property we live in provides a literal but pernicious measure of financial success or failure, a measure that either inflates our sense of self-made success or undermines our self-esteem. Danny may be impressed by her success, but he is also convinced that he is not good enough for Laura. He says as much to her. And on the surface, the play tempts us to think the same. Laura is the managing director of a company and has been very disciplined in pursuit of the success of her career. It's not clear what Danny does exactly, but he doesn't like it enough to be proud of it. He is also from Essex, she from this gentrified area of North London. And although Danny initially wears his Essex roots brashly, we gradually see that he does not conform with the simplistic stereotype of an Essex lad. We learn, for example, that he did a history degree at the University of Bristol, and that he likes to cook, albeit Jamie Oliver inevitably. The superficial class gap between them is all but gone, though, when they confess to a shared love of fish finger sandwiches, cheese balls, and Scotch eggs. All of which, in a relatively quiet way, serves to subvert the generalized cliches and prejudices about property and class. Class is also, of course, signaled by our accents and the colloquial language we use. During our podcast, Dave and I talked about the cliched, macho language that Danny uses in the first part of the play, in which he mimics vocabulary learned from his Essex mates. He tells his friend Keith, for example, that you're bang in there, referring to his chances with Laura, and further notes that Keith does not want for skirt. But the bullshiness of his language does not match the diffidence of his behavior. And when he calls Laura babe once too often, she calls him out on it. In fact, the way Danny speaks about women thereafter reveals that he has a much more nuanced and sensitive understanding of the appropriate attitudes to gendered sexual behavior. The language that he uses about love and sex betrays its sources in some of the common paradigms of male and female sexual roles, as revealed, for example, with his confessing that sometimes men like to be in the mood too, to counter the cliche that men are not always in thrall to indiscriminate desire, while referencing, of course, the reverse cliche that believes that women traditionally do need to be in the mood. When he asks Laura if she believes in love at first sight, he may be positing the possibility that something more important may be happening in their mutual attraction than just sex. An ideal he elaborates on when he expounds that women want to be treated as a person rather than an object. Although he is clearly quoting the politically correct parlance of feminism, we also recognize that he has an instinctive sympathy for this attitude, as revealed by his justifying its correctness by saying, "I've got a daughter, a girl who will be a woman and who must be protected from chauvinism." Although his language apes generic expression, his honest attempts to define his own feelings about love and sex show us why Laura describes him as a good man. We also talked in the podcast about the challenges of dating, particularly for people who have been hurt by the way previous relationships have failed. The classic behavioral model of dating seems to require that you present your best self forward to impress a potential partner enough to continue to the next steps. It begins, for example, with the profiles we build on social media that are so highly selective. But these relationships are also potentially extremely intimate and important ones. So while we are doing our best to create a favorable impression, surely if we are seeking a successful longer-term relationship, must also be sensible to be honest about ourselves. But this presents an inherent contradiction. How can one dare to confess to vulnerabilities when you are also hoping to impress someone, to give them confidence they can find strength from you even? As Danny and Laura's date unfolds, they become increasingly truthful with each other. Having both suffered heartache previously, They recognize that there is little point in dissembling. They'll only be found out at some point. They choose to shortcut the process, to defray the emotional costs. Their ultimate honesty is the poignant sequence at the end of the play when they are standing in only their underwear, exposed and vulnerable to each other and to us, the audience. It is a declaration of trust. It is brave. So that's it for our ragbag of footnotes on the plays that we've discussed on the podcast so far. Thanks for listening, and see you next time when we explore another great new or classic play.
Thanks for listening. To listen to other episodes, to find out news about future episodes, or to leave comments about what you've heard, please visit us at www.theplaypodcast.com. You can also follow us on Facebook or on Twitter at theplaypod. You're also welcome to email plays@theplaypodcast.com to suggest plays that we could talk about in future episodes. You can also register your suggestion on the website. Thanks again, and see you next time.